So in my last video, I talked about the concept of trading down in the first round of the NFL draft and whether or not history really bears out, whether that's a good thought process, a good strategy, a good philosophy or not. And honestly, after doing the research and piecing it together, it was a very, very mixed bag to say the very least. And I don't know if you can come away with a clear conclusion for sure that it's the right thing or not. Now, some people will always be convinced that that's the strategy to go with. Again, I understand it. Doesn't mean I fully agree with it, but I get it. So in this video, I wanted to talk about whether trading up in the NFL draft, trading up big in particular in round number one really makes sense and really bears out any differently than trading down big does. And when we talk about the philosophy of trading up, there are a few things that can kind of go into this. Number one, some fans and some media like when teams are aggressive and they show that willingness to do what it takes to move around, move up, and put themselves in a different position. Not being afraid to trade away some of that quantity in order to go get quality, because at the end of the day, it is still a star-driven league. Maybe not as much so as, let's say, the NBA, but the NFL is still, to a large extent, a star-driven league. You need stars in order to win championships at the end of the day. So there could be an appeal there for a team being aggressive and making a move up the board to try and get that star player. There's also that thought process of going out and getting the guy. And if you're a certain team in a certain position and you're picking in the back half of round number one, maybe there's a belief, foolish or not, that you're one player away, and this one player that you can go up and get can make all the difference in the world for you. So I get the philosophy here, but I have to say is that you take a big risk when you make that move up. In part because we're talking about the NFL draft, and you can look throughout the years and you say, hey, this team traded up to this spot, and maybe it worked and maybe it didn't, but they could have just stayed here and taken this guy or taken that guy. Or what would have happened if instead they traded back, or if they did just stay put and they took this guy or that guy. Sometimes teams will trade up to get player A when they could have just stayed put and taken a superior player in player B. This comes down to front offices, scouting departments, general managers, knowing what the hell they're doing, understanding the draft process and how the draft works, being able to piece together a talent board, a big board, understanding what talent should be ranked where. So all of that kind of fits in here, and all of this has to go into consideration. So now let's take a look here, and I'm focusing on the bigger moves up, picks going 5 or more up. Because if we start talking about the ones where they traded 1 spot up or 2 spots up or 3 spots up, and that's kind of a mixed bag. And that's kind of one where you'll say if somebody made that type of move, typically it doesn't cost you a whole lot. So it's not as big of a consequence if you miss on that pick or you make a mistake, as opposed to if you trade up 5 spots or 10 spots or 15 spots or in some cases 20 spots or more. There's a bigger risk there and a much bigger potential negative price to pay if you don't get it right. So looking back at the history, like I said, it's kind of a mixed bag. I'm going back to 2006 here. I'll start off with the Broncos. I'll just pick this one out because this involves a quarterback. They moved up from 15 to 11 in that draft to go get Jay Cutler. The Rams traded back and got Ty Hill. At the end of the day, you'll say, well, the Broncos in theory got the better part of that, in part only because of the fact that a few years later they were able to take Cutler and turn him into 2 first-round picks, a 3rd-round pick, and Kyle Orton. And in theory, that's true. But they traded up 4 picks here to basically get future draft pick currency. When you trade up like this, you're expecting to get a guy like Cutler, and you want him to be that franchise quarterback for a decade. The plan when you take a guy like Cutler is that if you're Mike Shanahan at that time, that you'll still be the head coach of the Denver Broncos, and that Jay Cutler will be a multiple-time Pro Bowler, and you'll be looking at this point in time a decade later and wondering when the time comes to find that heir apparent. Instead, he lasted 3 years in Denver, and off he went. Mixed bag for sure. Not exactly a successful trade-up for the Broncos. Because even the picks that they got later, I'm just saying. You look at 2007, and I talked about this in the trading down video, talking about the Jets trading up from 25 to 14. They went and got themselves some Revis Island. And obviously that pick has worked out really well, in particular when you look at the fact that this is a guy that they originally drafted, and then they fooled Mark Dominic into trading away a first-round pick for this guy, so that way he could come there for 1 year. That first round pick the Jets got, by the way, I believe was 13th overall, and that's what they used in 2013 to get Sheldon Richardson. Then he goes and plays a year in New England, and then the Jets get him back anyways. So basically, when you look at that move up, you sit there and say they got Darrelle Revis, but they also got Sheldon Richardson out of the deal. That's pretty good if you want to look at it from a big picture standpoint. But at the same point in time, the Panthers traded back from 14 to 25 and used the picks that they got in part from the Jets to get John Beeson and Ryan Khalil. Khalil's one of the best centers in the league. Beeson was a solid linebacker for them for several years. Obviously not with the team anymore. But did the Jets really come out that much better off for it? If I factor in the Sheldon Richardson part, probably. But if it was just pick for picks, in this particular case, it was kind of a wash. You look at 2008 and the disaster of the decision for the Jaguars to move up from 26 to 8 to get Derek Harvey. You don't make moves almost 20 picks up the board in round 1 to go get a defensive end. That's just dumb. And that's something that Eugene Smith and the Jaguars did at that time because they were stupid. Nothing more needs to be said about it. Obviously, the Ravens were a big winner on that. They took picks that they got from that and eventually turned them into Joe Flacco and Ray Rice. And a few years later, they won a Super Bowl. And now in 2016, the Jaguars are picking in the top 5 once again. You look at 09, an example of the trading up not really working out that well for the Jets. The moving up from 17 to 5 to go get Mark Sanchez. They gave up a few players, a couple of picks. Sanchez didn't really pan out. But it's one of these things that didn't really pan out. But it was kind of a weak draft to begin with. And it's not like they really missed out on much. So it kind of is what it is. The cost wasn't incredibly prohibitive in this particular case, even though they were moving up 12 spots and everybody knew it was to go get a quarterback like Sanchez. It wasn't that bad. 2010, though, you look at the Chargers trading up from 28 to 12. This is still at a time where you were starting to get this shift in the narrative about the running back position, but it wasn't entirely set in stone just yet. And to be fair, this was a team that for many years in the decade of the 2000s had enjoyed a lot of success with LaDainian Tomlinson as their featured guy, as their franchise offensive player. So you could understand, hey, I've had this guy all these years. I want somebody else like him for the next 7, 8, 10 years. So they went up and go get Ryan Matthews, and obviously that didn't work out. But you look at 2011, the Atlanta Falcons. They trade up from 27 to 6, and they go get Julio Jones. They got that stud. They got that all-pro, that consistent year in, year out Pro Bowl caliber talent, potentially a future Hall of Famer. If you have the chance in the draft to go get a Hall of Famer, regardless of the draft pick price, you go get him because those guys don't grow on trees. There are only a certain number of guys in the entire 95-year history plus of the NFL that are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. If you got a chance to get a guy that could someday end up with a bust in Canton, you do it and you don't look back, even though it could potentially impact you in other ways. The bottom line is at the end of the day, eventually you'll get your draft picks back. Eventually, you'll have other opportunities. You don't always have that opportunity to go get that guy. So the Falcons 100% made the right decision in 11 by going to getting Julio Jones. Whereas the Jaguars in 2011, it wasn't just the fact that they traded up from 16 to 10. It was the fact that they traded up from 16 to 10 because they wanted Blaine Gabbert because they were fucking morons, like I said 5 years ago. The funny thing is, all these years of looking for a pass rusher, and they're still looking for a pass rusher. They could have perhaps stayed put at 16 and taken Ryan Kerrigan, gotten a Pro Bowler out of the deal. Or if they were going to move up, look how ridiculous this trade up looks. Not just because Blaine Gabbert busted out totally for the Jaguars, but because the next pick, the Houston Texans took J.J. Watt. And all these years later, the Houston Texans have the best defensive player in the National Football League, a future first ballot Hall of Famer, and the Jaguars are still searching for that dude as an impact edge rusher. They've devoted draft picks and everything else, big money in free agency. They still haven't found that guy. Imagine if they do this trade-up that doesn't cost them a whole lot in terms of draft picks, and they get J.J. Watt instead. The entire narrative of the Jaguars' defense and the franchise and organization as a whole changes on the crux of that one pick. But then you look at 2012 and the Washington Redskins peeling up from 6 to 2 to go get RG3. We know that deal didn't really work out for the Washington Redskins, but again, it's not like the St. Louis Rams, with that bounty of picks that they got from this, made hay and made the most of it. You wonder, though, with the Redskins, maybe you liked RG3, but would their organization be better off if they would have just taken Ryan Tannehill at number 6? Or if they would have just said they're at number 6 and taken somebody like a Luke Kuechly, a Dontari Poe? These are the kind of legitimate questions that you can look back through the scope of history and ask, especially since they got their quarterback in the 4th round of that draft anyways in Kirk Cousins. If you're going to take that guy in the 4th round, why bother taking a guy in round number 1 and in particular trading up as much as you did to get him? That was as much as anything the foolishness of that draft. with the limited picks you had because you moved up from 62, you took a second quarterback with one of your remaining top picks in the 4th round of Kirk Cousins. Imagine if you devoted rounds 1, 2, and 3 to other players, and then you got Kirk Cousins in round 4, how much better off that organization would be now as a result. The Cowboys in 2012, for some reason, moved up from 14 to 6 to go get Morris Claiborne. I understand the thought process in terms of corner is a premium high money position in this league. No question about it. But they went and got a corner that wasn't particularly fast, it wasn't extremely athletic, and they paid the price for it. You give up a second-round pick to move up 8 slots, and the guy is a fringe player at the NFL level. The Dolphins trading up in 2013 from 12 to 3 to get Deion Jordan. You're talking about a team where obviously the move didn't work. It was stupid, but it's not like the Raiders made him pay for it. And it was not like it was a great draft anyways. But you look at it again, it's not just the execution of making the deal up, or the sacrificing of the picks. How much better would the deal look if they would have just taken Ezekiel Ansah number 3, just as an example, or Lane Johnson at number 3, just as an example. Maybe the next year they wouldn't have had to reach at 19 when they selected Jawan James, the tackle out of Tennessee. You know, you look at 2014, the Buffalo Bills traded up from 9 to 4 to go get Sammy Watkins. It's not like that was a bust-out, bad, dumb move. I mean, it's questionable to a certain degree, especially when you gave up a 1st or 4th round pick in the following year's draft to only go up 5 spots, especially in a draft class that was so loaded at wide receiver. This, to me, was a philosophical problem as much as anything else, and a lack of understanding of the draft process and the situation in that particular draft. That was an all-time epic wide receiver class. If I'm in a position, if I'm the Bills at 9, I'm not going to bother trading up and sacrificing next year's draft when I had chances are get a receiver that's just as good, if not better, as the guy that could potentially go number 4 overall. It's just not going to do it. It just doesn't make sense. So while Sammy Watkins hasn't been a bust, and it's not like, again, the Cleveland Browns made him pay for this trade because they are, of course, the Cleveland Browns, you look back on it and you say, in part, it's execution because they did pass up on somebody like an Odell Beckham Jr. or even a Mike Evans in that particular position when they moved up to 4. But it's the fact of, did you even need to trade anywhere to begin with? Just stay put. You know you're going to get a quality wide receiver. Why do you have such a hard-on for this guy when you have so many other guys on the board, in theory, that are pretty close to him in terms of overall potential, upside, and ability at the NFL level? You know, it just... You look at these, and you got Cooks when the Saints traded up from 27 to 20 to get him. They only had to give up a 3rd-round pick to go get the guy. He was a good fit for their system. He's been a good player for them, not a superstar or anything like that. But again, it's not that costly to move up from 27 to 20 as opposed to what it is to move up from 9 to 4 if you're Buffalo, or 12 to 3 like Miami did, or 6 to 2 to get a quarterback like the Redskins did. You know, sometimes it's about what position you're at in the draft or where you're trying to go in terms of the price of what it cost you and whether or not it's worth it. I will say this, when you look at the history of recent years, in particular trading up big for quarterbacks, it's not a very successful formula. So that should be a pause for concern for both the Rams and Eagles organizations and also for their fan bases, because maybe in part it's the fact of you bring quarterbacks into mediocre to bad situations, and then on top of that, you strip your ability in that draft and in the next draft or two to be able to help them and surround them with the talent that they need to thrive and survive at that position at the NFL level. It's just not a good formula for success. You know, RG3 didn't pan out. Blaine Gabbert didn't pan out. Jay Cutler, frankly, didn't really pan out. You know, you have to look at that. Mark Sanchez did not really pan out. These are all guys that teams traded up, you know, for differing prices, but they all made moves up the board and sizable moves up the board to go get these guys. And not a single damn one of them actually worked out. You know, it's one of these things. Big moves up, I guess, can work. You know, like I said, for Buffalo, because of the part of how bad Cleveland was, it doesn't look as bad. It still wasn't great. But they got Sammy Watkins, so they shouldn't feel terrible about it. Obviously, the Falcons getting Julio Jones was a tremendous coup for them, and you pay that price 100 out of 100 times. Darrelle Revis trading up for him really worked. But there's a lot of notable examples of where moving that far up the board just doesn't make sense because you're basically putting all of your eggs into that one basket. So you're stripping away your ability to have multiple shots, and you're putting so much pressure on that one guy to be that guy. And if he isn't that guy, it sucks for him and it sucks for your entire organization. You potentially set your organization back for years. See the 2008 deal with Derek Harvey as a perfect example. You know, frankly, the Chargers in 2010 trading up that far to get Ryan Matthews. You know, these are just, These are big moves for non-premium positions in today's NFL. Well, you could say Derek Harvey was a premium, but you don't trade up 18 picks to get a defensive lineman. You don't go from the late 20s to number 8. You just don't do that, period. Period. And these big moves can be costly in terms of, the additional cap numbers you have to throw into that one particular player. You're tying up more money the higher you move up the board into that one player, that one position, that one spot. Also costly in terms of draft pick currency in that draft and potentially in future drafts as well. I mean, at the end of the day, I guess as much as anything else, when you talk about trading up, especially those big moves up the board, you still got to execute. And we could use that type of subjective talk or whatever you want to reference it as when you talk about trading down. A lot of it comes down to execution. And I'll agree with that to an extent. That's not all it is. Sometimes the poor execution comes in making the trade up to begin with, similar to making the trade down to begin with. And to me, I don't understand these big moves up the board for non-elite talents. Like when the Falcons did it in 2011, you knew Julio Jones was an elite potential talent. That deal makes a ton of sense. But like when you look at 2013, the Rams in a doo-doo-ass draft traded up from 16 to 8 to go get Tavon Austin. He may have been, in theory, a top 10 talent in that draft for me, but it wasn't like he was an elite or special talent. I'm not giving up extra picks to move up 8 spots. I would rather roll the dice at that point in time and draft somebody like a DeAndre Hopkins. Draft him a little higher than people expect. Because even then, if he busts out, at least I've got other chances to make up for it on the back end. Like I referenced earlier, other smaller moves up like 1, 2, 3 picks can really be a mixed bag, and it depends. I don't worry about those as much. In my opinion, trading up can work, but I think it is best served for as such. When you're trading up in the bottom portion of round 1, like, for example, the Saints trading up from 27 to 20. That can work out because you got a guy, maybe you thought of him as a top 15 or top 10 talent in the draft or a top 20 talent, and you have the ability to go up and get him a little bit later than you would have anticipated him being there. As a result, I can understand that. The trade up philosophy that I agree with the most and I applaud the most and in fact advocate for the most are the deals where you take teams that are in the early to mid portion of round number 2 and they trade up back into the tail end of round number 1. Now, I'm not talking about the teams that will sit there and do that, but they'll give up a future first-round pick like the Saints did in 2011 when they peeled up and got Mark Ingram. Ingram's ended up being a solid player for them, but I'm not giving up a future first-round pick to move up into this slot in the draft this year. I'm just not doing that. That's stupid. Why would I take this year, want to move into 28, where next year I'm potentially giving up a top 10, 15, 20 pick? That just doesn't balance out. That just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But what I do advocate for, again, are those small moves up from the beginning to middle of round 2 to the tail end, the last 8 to 10 picks of round number 1. And there's a few reasons why. Number 1, it's an opportunity for a lot of teams to potentially get a second first-round talent in their draft class. Like I said, it is a star-driven league. The most stars you get come from the first round of the draft. This is true. You can get stars throughout. You can get good, solid players throughout. But your most likely chance of getting impact potential stars comes in round number 1. And if you're a team that can get 2 of those guys coming out of one draft, you got to feel really good about it. And I'll take a look, for example, to Minnesota Vikings. They did it 3 consecutive years, if you remember. In 2012, they traded up back into the tail end of round 1, and they got Harrison Smith. Do you think the Patriots would have wished that they would have just taken that guy at this point in time? Now, 2013, it didn't work out with Cordero Patterson. It is what it is. But then in 2014, you look at them peeling up to pick number 32 and taking Teddy Bridgewater. You talk about, for them, a young quarterback to build around for years. Whether he'll truly be a star or franchise guy or a good, solid starting quarterback is still yet to be determined. But they were able to get a long-term starting quarterback for them, at least for the time being, at an incredibly good cap value with that 5th extra year added on. And I'll talk about that in a second. It just made a tremendous sense, and it doesn't cost you a ton. So you have the chance to get a second first-round talent, and it's not very cost prohibitive. Let's say you're wanting to move up from 35 to 28, just as an example. You're talking about going to 28, you're going to give up 35, and you're probably going to give up a 4th round pick. Or if you're picking at 33 and you want to move up to 30, 31, 32 when there's 32 picks in the first round in a draft, for example, not this year, but other years, you might be looking at giving up that pick in either a 4th or a 5th rounder. And let's be honest, those picks, for the chance to get a second star talent, I'm going to give those up every chance I possibly can. So you could do that with the cost not being very prohibitive at all. It's not really even hurting you much within the current draft, and is most certainly, if you're smart, not impacting you in future drafts, which is great, which is genius, which is what you want to have happen. And then you get that extra guaranteed year. And I cannot emphasize enough, in particular if you're talking about quarterbacks and left offensive tackles and defensive ends and other edge pass rushers, and talking about corners. Those are really your premium money positions at the NFL level. Wide receiver as well would be that 5th category. If you get the chance to peel back up into the tail end portion of round 1 and get that guy and know that if he develops into a star, I could potentially have him under my control for 5 years as opposed to 4. And even in that 5th guaranteed year that comes with him being a first round pick, where the rest of the draft they only have 4-year deals, I'm still paying him a below market deal if he ends up being a star. And it gives me some leverage in terms of negotiating a long-term contract. You've got to do that. While there have been examples of this not working out, like Brady Quinn in 2007, Anthony Spencer so-so for Cowboys in 2007, Joe Staley, the 49ers, trading up for him like they did with the Patriots, I believe it was, back in 2007. That worked out very, very well for them. In 2009, the Packers did it with Clay Matthews. At this point in time, you look back at that draft and you say they might as well just taken Clay at number 9 instead of B.J. Raji. That worked out splendidly for him. Yes, there's been busts out like Javid Best in 2010 and so on and so forth. But you look at Harrison Smith in 2012, Doug Martin in 2012, Teddy Bridgewater in 2014. There are examples, and clear and present examples, that this can work and can work really, really well. And imagine how good you feel about a draft class if you feel like you got 2 first-round talents out of it. Well, the easiest way to potentially get 2 first-round talents out of a draft is to do what? Is to have 2 first-round picks. So I've got to be honest. Depending on the situation, I'm really not a big fan of making a massive move up. If it's an elite talent and he's going to be a franchise changer for you, or he's going to be a Pro Bowl, All-Pro, maybe even Hall of Fame possibility like a Julio Jones, then I can advocate it, a Darrelle Revis type. Then that makes sense to me. But I'm not trading up big to get a quarterback, frankly, because the recent evidence indicates that doesn't work for a variety of reasons. And I don't want to trade up huge, coming from the 20s to number 8 like the Jaguars did in 08 for Derek Harvey. That was just stupid. Why the fuck would you do that? Why the hell would you do that? It just makes no goddamn sense whatsoever. Because even if he comes in and he is that dude, is he really going to be that much of a franchise changer? And was he ever really an elite prospect to begin with? The answer is simply no. I'm a bigger, stronger advocate of the smaller moves, maybe in positioning sense, in terms of you're moving 1 or 2 picks up the board, because again, you're not giving up a whole lot unless you're at the very, very top of the draft in order to have that ability to go do that. But I'm an even stronger advocate of trying to trade back up if you're a team in the beginning to middle portions of round 2, foregoing that, trying to get back up into the tail end of round number 1, take the guy you were going to take in the second round anyways, and get that extra guaranteed year. It doesn't cost you a lot to do so from a salary cap standpoint. It's beneficial to you from a salary cap standpoint and a negotiating power standpoint with that 5th guaranteed year. It's an opportunity to get a second first-round talent, and with that cost not being prohibitive, to me, that makes a lot of sense. Trading up 10, 15, 20 picks, not so much.